Hello, here is the materials that we are going to be working with in today's demonstration. And everybody should have this or these materials in their kit. Pretty simple set here. We're going to have a few strips of your plaster fabric. You might have to, or what you are going to need to do is cut those strips to about a 1-inch thickness and about a 12-inch length. And that should be fine. I think the lengths are all the same that I gave you if you have your kit. So go ahead and just get a pair of scissors and cut those straight in halves or a good inch, and have a good maybe 8 to 10 strips. So in case you need some more. What we're going to be working with today also is your wire. And you see that I've cut each wire here, maybe a good 12 inches, a little longer. And also I want you to make sure that you keep your wire as straight or curved or naturally curved as possible. That's the best way to work with wire, because once you start bending it and crimping it, it's impossible to get that line straight. Today we're going to be working with line and what's called an armature. How do we start sculpting with other materials such as plaster and wire or metal in the vertical way? So you also are going to need your round bat that I provided for you. If you didn't get a chance to get the round bat, go ahead and grab a piece of plywood or some board that you have, so you can go ahead and put the screws in like I provided on the bat. The round bat here also has holes that I drilled or pre-drilled for you, and that's so we can anchor wire in any place that we want to make any type of sculpture that we want to, and we'll get to that later on. Okay, your bat also should have the screws that I provided for you ready to go, so we can tighten down wire and of course begin to create a form, right, that's going to be vertical. You're also going to need your needle nose, long nose pliers and your diagonal wire cutters. I have also provided those for you. Again, you probably have something like that in your garage or in the junk drawer somewhere. And a Phillips head screwdriver so we can tap in the screws when we're ready to go. Also, your quart cup here with some water, a towel or a rag that we can clean up and wipe that's going to be damp. Plaster here that is embedded inside this fabric, this cheesecloth fabric, is dusty, so we're not going to be using it very much. We're going to be wetting it immediately, but if there's any dust that arises, you do have your dust mask that you can put on, but it's going to be significantly less amount of dust than working with straight plaster like we did in the past. So make sure also that your hands are clean. If you do not like the touch of plaster, if you don't want to get it on your hands, that's fine. Your dish gloves or a pair of rubber gloves will work just fine. But remember, plaster does nothing to your hand. Maybe get a little dry, maybe mess with the cuticles a bit, but other than that, it's completely safe. And also, you're going to want a kind of nice area to work, and make sure that you have enough space and time to finish this assignment. So the next step, and I've zoomed in here so you can hopefully see the screws and the holes that we have ready pre-drilled, so it's easier to screw in. And remember, what I said is I would like you guys to keep the integrity of the curve of that wire. Now you can form it and shape it, okay, but it's also good to utilize that nice, good, clean line and edge, just like what we've been working with in those other demos, is that clean edge so light can break off nicely. Now remember, what we're doing here is an armature, which is a skeletal structure or support structure, so then we can put some more material on. So this assignment here is going to be a two-set assignment. First, we're just going to do a demonstration on how to build an armature in an abstract shape. Okay, we're not doing anything representational unless something kind of occurs in the process. Okay, maybe something does appear in your armature. And then after that, we have to let the plaster dry, the plaster fabric that we're going to be using, and then we'll come back in the next demonstration to begin to put some clay on there to talk about surface. But right now, remember, we're really just working with the skeletal structure to support clay on a form. The last assignment we were doing was more of a working from the base, getting lumps of clay, shaping them, and just stacking. We're doing something a little bit more complicated now, but it's also the way that you would do figurative work or any type of figurative sculpture, because like any body, you need a skeletal structure. So first thing I want you to do is grab a hold of your long nose pliers And I want you to see how I'm holding on to that wire form, how I have it facing upward, my index finger, and I have a good inch or an inch and a half or so from that area. And what I want you to do is I want you to use the very tip of your needle nose pliers, okay? And I want you to press down and bend that wire into a U shape like that. See how kind of curved that is? Okay, it's a slight curve, a tight curve kind of curve. Okay, or sorry, a paper clip kind of curve. And what that's going to do is going to allow us to bite down onto your screw here to anchor down the wire nicely, because we're going to be wanting to move this around, work it, bend it, and shape it, and even add plaster and clay onto it. So that anchor needs to be nice and tight. After you're done, you're going to choose anywhere and that you would want to add your first anchor. So you have an array of holes. So let's just place it anywhere. Don't really worry about it right now. Okay. Again, we're really just learning how to deal with the steps in the process. So it doesn't really matter at this point. Go ahead and grab your screwdriver and really tighten that down as tight as you can. Okay. Not too tight because we don't want to strip that and prevent you from actually tightening down. So you see how I have a nice kind of wire already anchored down. Okay. Now before I do anything with that wire, I want you to get another one and do the same thing. Okay. In another position. And again, doesn't really matter right now because you can always take these off and move them around later on once you get some ideas. But if you want to just go ahead and follow what I have, go right ahead in similar kind of distances of your anchoring down. Your holes might be a little different than what I have here, okay? But like again, it's really just more about learning how to work with the process. I'll do this one more time, okay? Holding that with my index finger and really bending that to a nice, good, sharp paper clip type form. I'm gonna just go ahead and put that over here in the opposite direction. Tighten that down. You're going to see with a lot of sculptural work that there's a lot of prep work that needs to be taken into account before you start getting creative, just because that's the nature of material. I mean, we have gravity as a default that we have to work with, so it takes a little bit more prep work before you get kind of into the creative forming. Okay, but still, that these small steps that we're doing here will influence your shape and your form, just like a drawing. The preliminary sketch that you do on the canvas or on the paper will influence the overall shape or the overall image or composition. Okay, so you see how I have two anchors down. I've zoomed out a little bit so you can already start to see some of the formal things that are happening with utilizing that curve and treating your wire like it's clay, like you're forming it, and it's not just arbitrary material. I'm gonna do this one more time. I want you to anchor 3 places onto your board. Another good tight curve there, and that's because a lot of times the tripod or the 3-point stance or whatever you would want to call it is the best support structure for a good, simple, or beginning sculpture. So 3 spaces, right, or 3 anchor points should get you where you want to go. Okay, so you see how I've chosen 3 areas for my initial armature sculpture. Okay, so I blackened out the background here so we can go on to the next step, which is how do we now attach wire to wire. And I think a lot of people have worked with wire in the past, whether it's just tying, something together, maybe back of a picture frame, and you're just used to kind of wrapping it together or just strapping it onto a bumper or something to hold on to something or whatever it is. But wire in the sculptural way, as a sculptural medium, likes to be used very delicately and very precisely. Remember, we're trying to create an armature, a skeletal structure here that can support the weight of clay and plaster that we're going to put on there. So our segments or the way that we're going to be attaching wire to wire is pretty important. So the way I'm going to teach you is a simple crimping way. I'm going to show you that in a bit. In order to simply attach wire to each other with simple segments, in order to create a construction. And that construction and that way that we're going to be attaching wire is going to be really what where the strength comes from, is the way that we attach these simple segments. Wire does not like to be twisted and twisted and twisted. It'll never grab. It'll slide and never anchor onto each other. So the way that I'm about to show you will provide a better grab, and then when we put plaster on top of this, the plaster fabric, it'll add an extra layer of strength. So I'm going to go ahead and get a scrap piece of wire here. Okay, and you should have plenty of wire that I provided for you. Okay, I'm just going to grab a nice good scrap. Okay, and I have my my wire cutter just holding down my other wire there, so you can get a better look at this wire that I'm going to attach to. So it's just one single wire of the three that I have here. Okay, I'm going to zoom in just a bit so we kind of see what I'm going to do here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is what we did in the last segment here. We're going to get a good solid inch of extra wire, index finger, right tip of your needle nose pliers to create your safety pin. Okay, and then what I want you to do is just hook it. Simply just hook it over that wire that you're trying to connect to. Okay, now all this can be done multiple times. You have plenty of wire that you could use. Okay, now you see how what I'm doing with my two fingers here. Okay, I am holding these two wires here, the other side of that paper clip, right? These two together so they do not crisscross. Okay, then I'm going to grab my needle nose pliers right next to that. Okay, right on top of that other wire. Okay, not necessarily right on stacking on top of it, but right next to it. I'm going to squeeze as hard as I can. Right there, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see right there what I've done is I've simply grabbed my needle nose pliers and crimped it right up against that, there it is, right up against that other wire in order to create a crimp. Now, you can see how that's nice and hewed over that, or wrapped nicely over that. And it's not a permanent type of a anchor. It's going to be just a loose anchor, but again, it's a clean segment, right? And it doesn't involve a lot of wrapping, a lot of twisting, a lot of wasting of wire. So that is a proper way of anchoring. Now, it's going to be a little loose, okay? But as long as it grabs, okay? After you anchor it down, you can go ahead and grab your right, and just really compress on it. Both hands, use the end of it, use the very back. You have more strength in the back of your, right? So just whatever you got to do, just go ahead and twist it. But again, you're going to need to control it. Make sure that you're not being too brutal on the pressure, that you're not bending your wire and ruining that edge and that line. So there it is. Okay, practice that 3 or 4 times with some extra wire. Now the key is using long enough wire. Remember, the reason why that wraps real nicely around that wire there is because I have the length down here that allows that flexibility. Metal needs metal to bend. Okay, it's called tensile strength. Okay, the ability to bend, right, without breaking. But that length, that's why I want you to have that good length of an inch or an inch and a half of wire when you do that paper clip bend, and that provides you a good line segment there. Now again, that's going to be loose a little bit, okay, but remember, we're going to add plaster and wrapping to the construction, and that will maintain or add extra strength to it. So after we've done some practicing with your crimping techniques, let's go ahead and talk about, well, how do we start connecting these 3 lines together? And what we're doing here is called freeform sculpture, meaning that, you know, we have a set of 3 nice curved forms. Again, we're going to try to keep the integrity of this shape. Okay, so we're dealing with line and edge. We're also dealing with negative space. Okay, and so I want you to think about how that negative space, you know, how do you interact with it? And before we start adding any wire to this with our 1 extra scrap wire, remember we're supposed to have 4 strips of wire, at least 12 inches long. That will be just fine. But before we add anything, let's go ahead and think about how do we start attaching some of these forms together to make something interesting. And that's really where you know, the visual feeling comes in how you feel about the shapes. These are not representational, these are abstracted forms, but I still want you to think about movement. I want you to think about the gesture line of a dancer, or the gesture line of a interesting plant or foliage, or the way that you picture swift movement. And we've all seen art and certain types of imagery with that type of stuff in there. So, you know, maybe we can just think about line, movement, negative space. And also remember, keeping that integrity of that line as clean as possible. So you see how it just kind of simply twisted it? And I kind of like that kind of that curved form and this spiraling up. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just do the same type of segmented connection on that top edge right here. So let me go ahead and do that. I'm not going to zoom in this time because you can always go back in the video and see how, again, how I've done it. But more importantly, lots of extra, about an inch and a half of extra wire. I'm going to make that nice U like we've done before. Okay, and then I'm just going to anchor that into place in the center right up here. Okay, hold that together. Remember, prevent that from crisscrossing, and compress that line right there. And you see how that's created an interesting just segment there. Now if these kind of lines right here get a little bit, you know, if they've been, remember, they're not supposed to crisscross, keep them like that. You can always trim these down, but hold on to it so it doesn't fly off. Those do snap. Okay, and that's only if you want to get that as clean as possible. So again, remember, there we are. We have a clean segment. I'm going to zoom in here. Clean segment at that area right there. And remember, it's always good to have a light source of some sort, maybe a lamp or something that you can kind of aim and focus on so you get some good light and shadow. So again, make a decision, make a connection somewhere, and you see how I've done that. And I want you to do the same thing with your other line. Again, you know, let's think about construction as well. How can I place this in a way that just helps support that wiggliness of these two areas? So remember, we're dealing with support structure, we're dealing with an armature here, we're dealing with constructing line and segments to certain points. All right, but remember, it is an art class, so go with what feels good at this point. That's what's more important, is that I like this shape. What's happening with this shape? Okay, so let me try another one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Okay, and I kind of like this curve happening at the top right there. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit better angle for you. Okay, I'm going to do this curve right here on top. Let me see what happens. Well, I can do here, or I can even connect it to this other line on this side. Okay. There we go. I got this line here, or I can connect it to this other line on this side right here. Now, let me just try that. Now, it's going to be hard for you to see that kind of depth. Okay. But it's okay. I'll spin it around in a bit so you can get a good picture of it, a good image of it. Okay. Again, tight line segment. I'm just going to choose an area right over here to attach that onto. And sometimes it's really just, you know, placing it somewhere, seeing how it looks. That's all you can really do. Okay, I'm going to tighten that nicely. Now, let's say that you're having a lot of trouble, right, getting that segment tight. A good trick is to get your wire cutter here, and you see that you have an angle side and you have a flat side. Put the flat side next to that eye slit. Right, and then you're not going to cut the wire, but it will help you. It will help you crimp some of that metal down, because you have a lot more strength with that knife edge than you do with your flatter edge. So you can always do your first crimp, right? Go to your wire cutter. You're not cutting through. You're just bending it, because you have a lot more strength with that knife edge. That's another way to do that. I'm going to go ahead and trim this off right here, because you know, you want to be careful that wire ends are sharp. So be careful that when you do cut things off, that they don't fly off into the other side of the room or something. So I'm going to spin this around just to observe kind of the abstracted forms that I'm kind of creating here. Right. Now I have one more loose segment. I want you to connect all three segments. So you see I have One, right? Two. Then I have my third one here for my other one. I got to choose a place that I'm going to put that, right? And that's going to really help the strength. So I'm just going to bend that to the side and think about connecting it right there. Okay? Again, we're doing free form here, so trust your instincts. Just make an interesting shape. Again, more importantly, that you're working with understanding the armature and the connecting a wire with the constructive techniques. You can also bend and shape some of these curves here. Maybe you want a dip in that, whatever you want. Okay, but again, remember, just try to utilize as much as this curve. You can put a bend inside there or a U shape or whatever it is, but don't get too aggressive with it because remember, that wire eventually just turns into a bunch of them. So I'm gonna attach this. Wire can be a little bit frustrating if you try to overwork it, and I guess that's my larger point. Don't overwork the wire form. So you see how I've really just attached 3 areas, and already I have some dynamic movement. That's a good angle right there. I have some dynamic movement. I have some interesting negative space. I have some scale. Okay, so go ahead and have fun with that, and then we'll move on to the next step. So for the last step here, in building your construction, we're still got to do some plaster work, but the last step of the wire work is I want you to take your last 4th piece and let's cut it into 2 equal sections. That'll give you 2 more lines that you're going to have to work with. So I'm going to change this shape up just a bit. You know, I've been looking at this. I got this interesting kind of teardrop shape happening. Almost kind of has like a kind of a fetus or some sort of position. I like that spiral form. Of course, it's going to look different in all different angles. So I'm going to just kind of maybe do something a little different up here. I want some scale, so I'll add something to the top. I'll raise the just a bit. Okay, so I'm going to just simply try to add a form or a different curve to what I have. Again, when you're working with that wire, use the curves of your hands and your thumbs to create that shape. It's almost like clay, how I'm kind of pulling it in the curve of my thumb so I can achieve some nice line. Remember, learn how to work with the material. Even though it's just wire, it's still similar, or it still has a molecular structure similar to clay in a sense that it's clay is platelet structures of small silica glass sheets or silica sheets. Well, metal has properties as well, molecular properties, that if you compress it and really work it within the thumb, you can achieve some pretty good curves, and that's what we really want. Remember, we want some interesting curve forms, right? Interesting negative space form. So I'm going to kind of think about something like that for now. I'm going to have to deal with this end in a bit because we're going to need to always attach every end. That's part of the assignment as well, is to make sure every end is attached to something. So I can change that later on, right? But I'm going to go ahead. Let me do that right now. Let me do a little bend to the side so it, you know, has a little bit of movement. It's not just a flat shape. So I'm going to attach this one first. Again, doing the same technique, right? Got an inch, a little over an inch, creating a paperclip U. Okay, going to hold that, preventing those from crisscrossing. Grab my tool, do a squeeze again. I can always use my wire cutters after I compress down flat side in order to keep that there. Okay, clean it up a little bit. And the reason why we want to clean up some of these ends is because when we do some wrapping with that plaster fabric, that's not going to get in the way. Okay, so that's pretty interesting there. I kind of like what's happening there. Okay, I need to deal with this other end. So what can I do? It's almost like a figure. If you can see, I kind of have this simplified head shape here. But let me see if I can attach that somewhere else. Let me bend that. Might have to straighten that out a little bit. Let me take it to this area right here. Okay. Let me see how that looks when I attach it. I'll spin that around in a bit. So I'm going to do the same thing here, maybe the opposite direction. get a good bend. Make sure that's nice and tight using the tip. Okay, and I'm going to come down here, see if I can attach it there and see what happens. Okay, do a spin around. So you can see how when you're working in the round with freeform sculpture, if you follow some processes and again utilize the way that wire is moving, you will create some dynamic form. And remember, you can always picture these types of shapes, 20 feet tall, just like what we talked about with your soft geometry assignment. Okay, I got one more to attach. So I'm kind of thinking also about structure. So you can see how I have a lot of wire at the top right here, right? But it's still, a little bit weak in a sense because there's a lot of length here, creating a lot of bounce and a lot of tinsel, a lot of flexibility. So let me kind of anchor something. I'm thinking if I put one wire and I attach it from that point here to this point here, it might give me some structure, right? So again, if I attach a wire from here to down here, that will prevent maybe some of that bending that's happening. Remember, that's something else I want you to play with is your structure, okay? But I'm thinking about line as well. If I turn it that way, I get more volume, more of a volumetric shape, with this attaching to that curve here all the way around. Or if I go this direction, I am more mimicking that shape. You see that kind of crescent shape that's happening with those two. I kind of like that better. Okay, and you can trim these down. That's a little long for me. I'm going to trim that down a bit, right? So it's okay if you need to do a little trimming. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, good inch. Attach that. I'm kind of thinking of where I'm placing this wire as well. Here, again, remember, you're going to come up with something different. And there's no reason to stress about what the shape is as long as it's structured properly and you're utilizing the line quality of the wire. Something interesting is going to happen. Trust me. Okay. So I have that there. It's a little bit long, so I'm going to trim that down so it doesn't get tangled up in my plaster and fabric. Okay. Remember, if that's still a little bit too loose, use the wire cutter. Do not cut through. You're just trying to get that knife edge to take it down a hair. Trim that off as well. I like to get things pretty clean. And then I got to think about, okay, down here, how am I going to attach that bottom area? Okay. So let me go ahead and do another U. Okay. See that flexibility, how it's going to make it pull. And that pull, that tension will provide some structure to it. Okay. When you do these crimps, you got to make sure like you got your elbows up. It's almost like you're doing kind of almost like you're a dentist of some sort. You're kind of really relying on your instruments and your flexibility of your body so you can really work around it. And of course, be gentle and delicate with the subject. Okay, so you see how I've finished attaching all my shapes. And you can see the dynamic movement, the negative space. And it's almost like cheating in a way when you work with material and its industrial qualities. The fact that this is an industrial material that is spooled at the factory. Well, it's very similar to the way the color of a tube of paint is, manufactured to look a certain color. So sculptors really do look at material in the same way. The way plywood is manufactured, well, that's a plane. That plane can be cut into shapes. And of course, the way wire is structured and rebar, even into larger scale sculpture. I mean, we're doing the same thing that an artist would do if you were using, half-inch thick rod steel, and that would be on a larger scale, but still dealing with the same formal properties. Remember, the only thing that makes that different is the type of tools you use versus, your pliers. You'd be using welders and stuff like that, but it's the same concept, and that's what's more important about learning these properties. It's not the fact that this is made out of rebar and heavy steel is the fact that formally you're doing something interesting. Because somebody can take a sculpture like this and make this 20 feet tall. But what's more important is the shape, right? It's the investigation of negative space, line quality, movement. Okay. So go ahead and connect all your wire together in an interesting shape, and then we'll move on. Okay, so the last step here is to make sure that you have your plaster fabric strips here and your container of water. And all we're going to do is simply activate the plaster that's on there just by wetting it, and we're going to do a clean wrapping, as clean as we can get it, on each wire here, of course, to give it that strength. What we're dealing with plaster here, or is called compression strength, and remember with the metal here, we're dealing with tensile strength. Now, compression strength is, every material or property that deals with any type of compression. That would be, let's say, clay bricks. Plaster is a form of that type of structure. So in other words, compression strength means that it can achieve downward compression, but if it was a long stick of plaster, it would not have any tensile strength. It would actually snap. But when you combine both compression strength materials such as plaster, cement, things like that, and you could combine that with your metal, then you have a structure that you can build anything vertically with, hence skyscrapers, rebar and concrete and sidewalks and things like that. So just to kind of let you know, remember that the properties that we're working with these materials, if you understand them, then you really understand how to develop scale and structure. So again, tensile strength with the metal, okay, and compression strength with the plaster and fabric. Okay, two different types of strength that really need to be understood when you're making any type of construction. Now, all I'm doing is just dipping that plaster into that water and just kind of activating that plaster. The thing you might want to do is kind of fold it in half, but be careful that you're not kind of swiping that off of the wire. And I'm just going to start anywhere. I'm going to start in this kind of point here. I have some of those hooks there that I can just snag that fabric on, and then gently begin to wrap it as neatly as you can, obviously. Okay, now it's not going to look like the clean edge of the wire, obviously, because, it's fabric and plaster, but I still want you to think about, as you are wrapping, that you are trying to maintain a level of craft, so, it looks good. Even though we're going to be covering these wire forms eventually with some clay, you still want to make sure that all steps in between maintain that sense of craft. Now I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom here, try my best to maintain that consistent wrapping, and I want to make sure that I do try to go as close to the screw as I can that's anchoring the bottom. Okay. Now when you achieve that first wrapping, what's nice about this plaster gauze is that it can kind of be sculpted and shaped. So you see how I'm kind of working that plaster and shaping it just a bit, because that cheesecloth is such a fine cloth that it can compress fairly nicely. So there's my first wrapping. I'm going to grab another strip here, activate it just with some water. Okay. Again, I'm going to try my best to somewhat fold it into almost a shoelace type of thickness. Remember, as you're doing that, try not to wipe too much plaster off, and then I'm just going to continue on from that point. Plaster loves to grab onto itself, so all you got to do is find an anchor point and then do some wrapping until it starts to grab. All the way around it. So remember, we're also adding a making these wire armature forms stronger because we're adding that plaster to it. But it serves another purpose. It helps us, this clay that we're going to be using, which is an oil-based plasticine clay, different from the ceramic water-based clay that we used last time. But it helps that clay stick to that armature, because if we just try to put clay on a wire form, or just a wire in general, believe me, it will slide right off and won't have anything to grip to. So this also provides a grip for our clay to stick to. Again, after you've done that, do a little finger work to kind of smooth it out. You want no wire showing, so if you can help it, try to have no wire, okay? And you can also cut smaller sections and kind of do some patchwork around the areas that you didn't completely cover. I'm going to keep going here, so you can kind of get the picture that I'm just kind of tying this around completely. Okay, shoelace that up. You don't want it too thin. Okay, and then of course continue on. And you could use this type of plaster fabric almost as an additive sculptural process, meaning that you can keep wrapping and build mass with that. So a lot of artists just work directly with this. What's great about plaster is that it can be polished, it can be painted, it can be stained, because it's a very porous material. So after this dries, you can continue to build and build and build and build. So some people just like to work directly with plaster and wire, and then of course cover it with different types of material to achieve different surfaces. You're also going to be careful with the weight of plaster. So that's why your wire structure should be stable and not too floppy, because you are adding weight. So if those segments aren't anchored properly, or let's say you haven't designed a structure that is freestanding strongly, the weight of the plaster will slump it down. So if that tends to happen as you are doing this step, remember, you can always add more wire. I can sit here and add more metal wire to it to help that structure if I wanted to. But mine seems to be holding up fairly well. Okay, again, pad that down, get that nice and smooth. And you can see how the plaster is kind of accumulating on my hands. So it's good to kind of keep your hands wet, and always make sure that you do have your damp cloth. So every so often you can get some of that off. So you can see as I'm proceeding on, making sure that I'm wrapping every single wire, really making sure that I go all the way down, as far down to the screw. Tie it like a knot down there. And even in this few minutes that I've been doing this, the plaster's been curing and already adding a sense of structural rigidity to the form as a whole. And I'll continue on and fast forward and show you a few Now when you do these areas right here on these segmented corners, make sure that you tie it into the other segment like I did there, and then begin to wrap that part up. That will help it just add a little bit more strength and again structure to that. Now at some point I want you to be careful with flexing your wire too much while your plaster fabric is curing. At some point you're going to feel it get rigid, so what we don't want to do is crack the plaster as it's curing. That would kind of deactivate all those properties of plaster. So you want at some point, if you feel that it's starting to crumble off, you're going to want to let that cure until a good hardness, then come back and continue on with the rest of the wrapping. So this does not have to be done in one setting. This can be done in 2-3 settings. Okay. One thing that I do want you to pay attention to and to maintain is to grab a scraper of some sort and just keep that base clean. So every so often, as you're wrapping, and I got one more piece to do, or at the end, to make sure that that bottom that you're cleaning up, all that kind of scrap plaster that's down there. Okay, the best thing to do is to, while you're working, is just get your damp rag and just continuously clean it, because you're going to keep dropping plaster down there at the base. So you know, some of these processes need to maintain some sort of tidiness. Don't have to be, you know, too much of a clean freak about it, but it does help later on that we have that board clean. And I'm almost done here. I'm wrapping my final piece. You can see this one wire right here that I need to do. Again, make sure that you tie in that wrapping around a corner there, around a segment, just so that compression strength is connected to the rest of that plaster wrapping. And now my form is pretty rigid. Got some flexibility at the bottom, but I can, that'll work. That will work. Okay, I'm going to wrap that around nicely, make sure it's tied in. And then after that, final step is to pat it down. Make sure those segments are compressed and that plaster is soaked into all those small little negative spaces of the fabric. And do not forget to observe every step of the process and analyze shadows, breakage of light, and the texture. So the final step after you've wrapped all your wire is just to take care of the bottom, because you see how there's still some more flexibility down there. So just to kind of anchor that down a little bit, all we're going to do is to make sure that you have, you know, maybe some half strips. I've cut this in probably about a 6-inch, so maybe just a kind of a strip, and let's just kind of make a foot, and that'll be your last step. So I'm going to kind of work it underneath as tight as I can. All right, and we're just going to kind of sculpt real simply, cover that screw area. Okay. Doesn't matter if the screw shows a little bit. Okay, see how I just made like a simple kind of little foot there. Real easy. Now remember, all this is all forgivable. I mean, that's what's great about plaster and you know, working with metal. Let's say you want to change your mind. You don't like what you've done. You come back in the morning, you take a look at your piece, and you're like, I don't know, maybe I like this. Well, you know, you can take a box cutter or take a screwdriver or your needle nose pliers and just rip all this off, right? And then do something else. Screws will still be fine, and you can unscrew them. Might have to dig out some plaster from the Phillips head area, but other than that, it is good. You see how also I've cleaned my my area, keeping it clean. Work on my last foot here. And even though we're not anchoring that much, you know, just the fact that that plaster is going to get hard, we'll just add just a slight more stability at the bottom there. After you're done with all that, make sure you are wiping all that extra plaster off. You don't want that to harden, and if it does, just take the scraper to it. But plaster's a lot easier when you work with it wet, and you take care of all that stuff when it's wet. And there we go. That should do it. Here is the finished part of this demonstration, and you can see how, you know, I've maintained a sense of the form. Didn't alter it too much while I was adding my plaster fabric, and it definitely has created some rigidity. You're going to want to let this dry overnight so that plaster will be nice and set before we apply some clay on it, which will be your next demonstration. Again, remember, we're playing with negative space, line, and the curve. So let's see if we can definitely have a good time playing with free-form sculpture in order for us to then continue on applying clay onto this armature. I really hope everybody had a good time working with wire. I really hope the wire opened up some possibilities, and the technique of adding the plaster opened up more possibilities. And remember, you can always add more wire to this in certain areas if you want to continue with the growth of the sculpture. So it's really up to you. This is the minimum I would want you to work with, but you can definitely imagine adding, you know, 10 more wire to this and sections, and how tall it can grow. Remember, that growth is the combination of the tensile strength and the compression strength for both the properties of the metal and the plaster. So definitely a great way to work vertically in the freeform sculpture style. I hope everybody had a good time, and I look forward to showing you some more processes in the future. Thank you.